That's fascinating. We are talking in a class that I'm taking right now about ancient Near East nations. We're talking about how, kind of as you said, it would have been perceived that if one nation conquered another nation, that would mean that that nation's gods would have been considered more powerful than the god of the defeated nation. Um, and I think that seems like such an ancient idea, but now that I'm thinking about it, it seems so applicable. It seems like it can be hard sometimes in the modern day to say Yahweh's reigning, and to like say that to someone who has suffered profoundly, or who, if their particular people group has suffered, it's hard to say, oh, well, Yahweh's been reigning this whole time. He's not defeated, because it doesn't look like he's reigning. Um, can you talk a little bit about how that like idea that Yahweh's reign is perpetual and undefeated can be applied to the modern day, even when it doesn't always seem so obvious?
Yeah, this is where I would increasingly point you to, especially Second Corinthians, because
Hmm.
Second Corinthians is all about Paul dealing with all kinds of criticisms of his so-called apostleship. He's got these super apostles that have criticized him, and they've thrown him under the bus for all these various things because he doesn't have these kinds of credentials. He doesn't have doing so on and so forth. There's several things that he's actually accused of, and Paul then actually is forced to boast about who he is, and so he describes his credentials as an apostle, but it's all about his weaknesses.
Hmm.
It's all about the things he suffered,
Hmm.
so that his life of suffering in the mission ends up becoming his validation of his apostleship. Why? He then describes himself and others who are like him as being processed in a prisoner of war parade. So in the ancient world, you have the conquering king or the emperor would have his army bring back the prisoners of war that they have taken as they've defeated the enemy, and they would be paraded down the street of the city, and they would be brought to the end of whatever place it was going to be. They would be publicly executed.
Hmm.
And as they were walking through the city, the temple doors, they always had temples everywhere. If you go to, for instance, Corinth, there's temples everywhere.
Hmm.
The temple doors would have been open, and they would have been burning incense to their gods and goddesses. And those doors then would allow that incense to waft into the air, so that as those prisoners are walking down to their doom, people would have been not only cheering their army but thanking their gods as this aroma
Wow, that's
comes.
intense. Wow.
So then Paul says we are like that we are being led in this victorious procession, but it's this procession of weakness. It's this procession of suffering that now is the means by which the fragrance of Christ, not the other gods and goddesses, but it's the fragrance of Christ that is being given off. Why? Because they in a sense embody the sufferings of Christ. They become sort of a living parable that points to who Jesus is.
Hmm.
Peter does the same thing in 1 Peter 2. He quotes from Isaiah 53 and the suffering, and he says, this is an example for us to follow. So the suffering of the Christians in this era needs to be understood as part and parcel of the church's role of pointing the nations to Jesus. That this foolish, weak, unexpected gospel of a crucified Messiah is actually the means by which people are saved. So it redeems so much of our suffering as we walk with the Lord, whether it's religious persecution, or I think you can even apply it more to simply individual physical suffering
Hmm.
that you wouldn't expect to be in the life of the person who's faithful to God. But that person who experiences this and then gives testimony to the grace of God and to the victory in Christ, it becomes a really, really powerful pointer to Jesus. I think that's why people like Johnny Erickson Tata have been
Yeah.
so effective through the years, because she was not healed.
Yes.
And yet she's been giving constant testimony to Jesus. People listen to her, and many, many people have been brought to faith.